Picture the White House. You've seen it 1,000 times, in photographs, on television, in every American history textbook. That gleaming white mansion at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, home to every US president since the second one, actually. The first president never lived there, which is one of several things they don't usually mention in the tourist brochures. There are other things they don't mention either, like the fact that the man who designed it was an Irish immigrant inspired by a Dublin mansion, or that the first president to actually move in used the grand ballroom as a laundry room because nothing else was finished, or that the British burned the entire building to the ground in 1814, and when it was rebuilt, they painted it white specifically to cover the smoke damage. But the biggest thing they spent centuries not mentioning, the detail that was quietly omitted from official histories, glossed over in textbooks, and only recently acknowledged with small plaques in educational programs, is this. A significant portion of the White House was built by enslaved workers. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, literally. Enslaved men quarried the sandstone, cut it into blocks, hauled it to the construction site, lifted it into place, and built the walls of America's most famous mansion. Enslaved carpenters, masons, and blacksmiths worked alongside free craftsmen to create the building that would become the symbol of American democracy. The payroll records survive. The names, mostly, don't, because enslaved workers weren't listed by name in the official documents, just as labor costs paid to their owners. They built the house where presidents would live, where the Emancipation Proclamation would eventually be signed, where the entire machinery of American government would operate for over 2 centuries. And for most of American history, nobody talked about it. Tonight, we're talking about the political compromises that created the Capitol, about the Irish architect who designed the president's house, about the free craftsmen and enslaved workers who built it together, about the First Lady who had to hang her laundry in an unfinished ballroom, about the British soldiers who burned it all down, and about how America spent nearly 200 years trying to forget who really built the White House. If you enjoy these journeys through history, please subscribe and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's talk about how America built its most famous house on a swamp, with enslaved labor, and spent centuries pretending otherwise. In 1790, the United States of America had a problem. The country was 13 years old, had survived a revolution, ratified a constitution, and elected its first president. But it didn't have a permanent capital. Congress met in New York, then Philadelphia, then New York again, then back to Philadelphia. The federal government moved around like a startup company, working out of different coffee shops because nobody could agree on where it should actually be. This wasn't just logistical chaos, it was political warfare. Northern states wanted the capital in the north. Southern states wanted it in the south. Every city that hosted Congress briefly became convinced they should keep it forever. Every state that didn't have the capital felt slighted and suspicious. The solution came from one of the most famous backroom deals in American history, the Compromise of 1790, hammered out between Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison over dinner. Hamilton desperately needed federal assumption of state debts. His entire financial plan for the new nation depended on it, but southern states were blocking it because they'd already paid off most of their war debts and didn't want to subsidize northern states that hadn't. Jefferson and Madison wanted the permanent capital located in the South, where Virginia could influence it, rather than staying in northern cities where Federalists dominated. So they made a deal. Southern representatives would support Hamilton's debt assumption plan. In exchange, the permanent capital would be built on the Potomac River, on the border between Maryland and Virginia. Slave states, both of them, in a region where Southern politicians would feel comfortable and influential. It was the kind of political horse trading that built America, expedient, pragmatic, and deeply morally compromised. The Residence Act of 1790 authorized President Washington to select a specific site along the Potomac River for the new federal city. He chose a location that included land from both Maryland and Virginia, though Virginia's portion would eventually be returned. The site was marshy, undeveloped, and required massive amounts of clearing and drainage work. It was also conveniently close to Washington's own Mount Vernon estate, which surely had nothing to do with his choice and was purely coincidental. The new capital would be called Washington, obviously, and it would include 2 major buildings, the Capitol, where Congress would meet, and the President's House, where the chief executive would live. Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French engineer who'd served in the Revolutionary War, was hired to design the new city. His plan was grand, ambitious, and wildly impractical, a Baroque masterpiece of radiating avenues, ceremonial spaces, and geometric precision that looked magnificent on paper and would take a century to actually build. L'Enfant envisioned the president's house on a prominent site overlooking the city, connected to the capital by a grand avenue. It would be one of the focal points of the new capital, a symbol of the executive branch's power and dignity. There was just one problem. The entire site was essentially wilderness. Forests, swamps, a few scattered farms, and not much else. They weren't renovating an existing city or expanding an established town. They were building a capital city from scratch in the middle of nowhere. This is the 1790s equivalent of deciding to build your company headquarters in an empty field 3 hours from the nearest airport and expecting everyone to be excited about it. But Washington was determined. The capital would be built, the president's house would be magnificent, and it would all happen on schedule. Spoiler, it did not happen on schedule. In 1792, the commissioners overseeing construction of the new capital held an architectural competition for the president's house. They wanted designs that were impressive but not royal, grand but not excessive, symbolic of Republican virtue but also actually functional as a residence and office. This is like asking for a house that's both humble and impressive, affordable and luxurious, minimalist and ornate, basically impossible to satisfy everyone. The competition attracted various submissions. Thomas Jefferson, who never missed an opportunity to architecture, submitted an anonymous design based on classical Roman villas. It wasn't selected, which must have annoyed him given that he thought he was the smartest person in every room he entered, including rooms full of professional architects. Some submissions were too grand, too European, too reminiscent of royal palaces. The commissioners wanted something distinctly American, though nobody could quite define what that meant since America was 13 years old and still figuring out its architectural identity. The winning design came from James Hoban, an Irish-born architect who'd immigrated to America and established himself in Charleston, South Carolina. Hoban's design was perfect for what the new republic needed. Georgian style, classical proportions, impressive without being ostentatious. It balanced grandeur with restraint, European architectural tradition with American Republican sensibilities. The design was heavily inspired by Leinster House in Dublin, the Duke of Leinster's residence, which Hoban would have known from his training in Ireland. Leinster House was elegant, symmetrical, and refined without being overwhelmingly palatial. It was mansion-sized but not castle-sized, which was exactly the tone the American commissioners wanted. Hoban's design featured 3 stories: a Georgian facade with balanced windows, a central entrance, and interior spaces organized for both public ceremonial functions and private family life. The building would be constructed primarily of sandstone, painted or whitewashed for protection and appearance. President Washington himself influenced the final design, requesting that Hoban make it larger than originally planned. Washington had specific ideas about scale and proportion, having visited impressive houses throughout his life and understanding that the president's house needed to make a statement about American capability and permanence. Hoban won the competition, a prize of $500, and the commission to oversee construction as superintendent. He would spend the next several years of his life managing one of the most complex construction projects in American history, dealing with supply problems, labor shortages, political interference, and the constant challenge of building a mansion in what was essentially a muddy clearing in the woods. The design was approved, the site was selected, construction could begin. All they needed now was workers. Lots of workers. Free craftsmen, immigrant laborers, and, though this wasn't advertised in the architectural competition announcement, enslaved workers whose labor could be rented from their owners for a fraction of what free workers would cost. On October 13, 1792, the cornerstone of the president's house was laid in a ceremony that was probably more impressive than the actual construction site deserved. The site was a partially cleared lot, muddy, uneven, and requiring significant preparation before any actual building could begin. First, they had to level the ground, then install drainage, because building a mansion on swampy land without proper drainage is how you end up with a mansion that slowly sinks into the then clear remaining trees and vegetation. then dig the foundation trenches. This was all hard, unskilled labor, digging, hauling, clearing, and it was performed primarily by enslaved workers and day laborers. The foundation itself was stone, which would support the massive weight of the sandstone walls above. The stone came from local quarries and had to be transported to the site, shaped, and set in place with mortar. The exterior walls would be built from Aquia Creek sandstone, quarried about 40 miles south of the construction site in Virginia. Aquia Creek sandstone was readily available, relatively easy to work with, and had a pleasant tan color that would eventually be painted white, though nobody knew that yet in 1792. Quarrying sandstone is brutal work. Workers had to cut massive blocks from the quarry face using hand tools, shape them roughly on site, then load them onto boats for transport up the Potomac River to the construction site. Each block weighed hundreds of pounds. Moving them required coordinated human effort, simple machines like pulleys and levers, and a lot of swearing in multiple languages. The workforce at the White House construction site was diverse in a way that reflected America's complicated reality. Free white craftsmen, many of them immigrants, enslaved black workers, skilled and unskilled, and free black laborers all worked together to build the house. Payroll records from the construction survive in the National Archive. They show payments to stonecutters, masons, carpenters, plasterers, and other craftsmen. They also show payments to enslaved workers' owners for the rental of their labor. This is where the historical record gets uncomfortable and also clarifying. The builders of the White House didn't hide the use of enslaved labor. They documented it in official payroll records because it was considered normal, legal, and economically practical. Enslaved workers were hired out by their owners, who received payment for their labor. The enslaved workers themselves received nothing except sometimes small tips or incentives. They had no choice about working on the project. They couldn't quit if conditions were dangerous or pay was unfair, because there was no pay and they weren't free to leave. The historical record lists some names of enslaved workers, but not many. Most are recorded only as labor costs paid to specific owners, hired slave labor from Mr. Owner's name. The enslaved workers themselves, their names, their lives, their experiences, weren't considered worth documenting. This erasure from the historical record is itself part of the story. The White House was built by people whose contributions were documented as expenses, but whose identities were considered irrelevant. Construction progressed slowly through 1793 and 1794. The foundation was completed. Exterior walls began rising, but everything took longer and cost more than planned, which is apparently universal to construction projects across all of human history. Weather was a constant problem. Too hot, too cold, too wet. Supply delays were constant, stone deliveries late, craftsmen leaving for better paying work elsewhere, tools breaking, and the workforce was never quite large enough, which meant constant pressure to hire more workers, which meant more enslaved labor, because it was cheaper than hiring free craftsmen. By 1795, the exterior walls were rising steadily, but it was clear that this project would take years longer than originally estimated and would require continued reliance on enslaved labor to meet budget constraints. The workforce that built the White House was a cross-section of early American society, which means it was complicated, hierarchical, and deeply unjust. At the top were the skilled craftsmen, stone cutters, masons, carpenters, plasterers, who commanded good wages and had some autonomy over their work. Many were immigrants: Scottish stonemasons, Irish carpenters, English plasterers, bringing old world skills to new world construction. These craftsmen were proud of their work and their expertise. They trained apprentices, maintained quality standards, and expected to be paid reliably and respected professionally. When pay was late or conditions were poor, they could and did walk off the job, forcing commissioners to negotiate better terms. Then there were the enslaved skilled workers, carpenters, masons, blacksmiths, who possessed the same expertise as free craftsmen, but worked under entirely different conditions. They were hired out by their owners, who collected their wages. They had no ability to negotiate pay, refuse dangerous work, or leave for better opportunities. Some enslaved skilled workers were allowed small measures of autonomy, living separately from their owners, managing their own time outside work hours, earning small tips from employers. But this autonomy was always conditional, always revocable. always dependent on their owner's permission. Working alongside both groups were unskilled laborers, free and enslaved, who did the hard physical work of hauling materials, mixing mortar, digging foundations, clearing debris. This was backbreaking work in all weather, poorly paid if you were free, unpaid if you were enslaved. The historical record shows that enslaved workers were essential to the project at every level. They weren't just doing unskilled labor, while free craftsmen did the sophisticated work. Enslaved workers were performing skilled masonry, carpentry, and other crafts that required years of training. One surviving record shows payment to an owner for an enslaved worker described as a very good stone cutter. Another shows payment for enslaved carpenters working on interior framing. Another for blacksmiths making and repairing tools. These weren't peripheral contributions. These were core functions of the construction process, performed by enslaved workers who had no choice but to use their skills to build a house celebrating freedom and democracy while they themselves remained property. The dynamics between free and enslaved workers on the construction site were complex. Free craftsmen sometimes worked directly alongside enslaved craftsmen on the same tasks. Sometimes they supervised enslaved workers. Sometimes they competed for work, with free craftsmen resentful that enslaved labor drove down wages. Commissioners managing the project viewed enslaved labor primarily as a cost-saving measure. Hiring enslaved workers was cheaper than hiring free workers, which helped keep the project within budget, or closer to budget, since the project was perpetually over budget anyway. The contradiction was stark and apparently unremarked upon at the time. They were building a house for the president of a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality, using labor from people who had neither. Safety was a constant concern. Construction sites in the 1790s were dangerous. No OSHA regulations, no safety equipment beyond common sense, no workers' compensation if you were injured. Free workers who were hurt might receive some compensation or medical care. Enslaved workers who were injured were just additional costs to their owners. We don't know how many workers were injured or killed during construction. The records don't document such things comprehensively, but given the scale of the project, the primitive equipment, and the dangerous nature of construction work, injuries were certainly common, and deaths were likely. By 1797, the exterior walls were essentially complete. The building was taking shape, recognizable as the design Hoban had proposed 5 years earlier. But the interior was still unfinished, and the slow pace of construction was becoming a political problem. President Washington's 2 terms were ending. John Adams would be inaugurated in March 1797 as the second president, and the president's house, the building Washington had commissioned and overseen, still wasn't ready for occupancy. Washington would never live in the house named for him, built in the city named for him, that he'd spent years helping to plan. He would leave office and return to Mount Vernon, and the house would be finished by someone else. This probably bothered him more than he admitted publicly. Washington cared about his legacy, about permanence, about building things that would last. The president's house was supposed to be part of that legacy. Instead, it became someone else's problem. In November 1800, President John Adams became the first president to move into the president's house. The building was technically habitable in the same way that a house with no interior doors, unreliable heating, and an unfinished ballroom is technically habitable. Adams and his wife Abigail arrived to find an active construction site with some furniture in it. The exterior walls were complete and painted white, or whitewashed. The historical record isn't entirely clear which, giving the building its distinctive appearance. But the interior was another story entirely. The East Room, designed to be the grand ballroom for state receptions, wasn't finished. No plaster on the walls, no decorative elements, no furniture. Abigail Adams, practical as always, looked at the massive empty space and decided it would make an excellent place to hang laundry. So the grand ballroom of the president's house, designed for diplomatic receptions and ceremonial functions, became the First Lady's laundry room. She strung up clotheslines and hung presidential laundry to dry in what was supposed to be the most impressive room in the house. This is the equivalent of moving into a mansion and using the ballroom as a storage unit because nothing else works yet. Other rooms were barely finished. Plaster was still drying. Fireplaces didn't draw properly, filling rooms with smoke. The heating system was inadequate for a building this size, leaving the Adamses cold and miserable during their first winter. Abigail wrote letters to family members, complaining about the conditions. The house was enormous but uncomfortable. The grounds were undeveloped, mud, construction debris, piles of materials, no landscaping. Getting supplies required traveling into the barely developed city of Washington, where shops were scarce and services limited. Staff accommodations were chaotic. The Adamses had brought servants with them, but housing them in an unfinished building while construction continued was complicated. Some staff lived in temporary quarters on the grounds. Others commuted from boarding houses in the scattered parts of Washington that actually had housing. Despite all this, Adams attempted to host official functions at the president's house. These events must have been awkward, guests arriving at a mansion that was clearly still being built, walking through finished rooms into unfinished ones, pretending not to notice the laundry hanging in the ballroom. The Adamses lived in the president's house for only 4 months. Adams lost the 1800 election to Thomas Jefferson and departed in March 1801, probably not sorry to leave. He and Abigail had established that the house could technically be occupied, but they'd also demonstrated that it desperately needed more work before it would be a proper presidential residence. That work would fall to Jefferson, who had opinions about architecture, the way some people have opinions about sports teams, strong, frequently expressed, and not always welcome. Thomas Jefferson moved into the president's house in March 1801 with plans to make it better, which is very on-brand for Jefferson, who never met a building he didn't want to redesign. Jefferson was a talented architect. His design for Monticello is genuinely innovative, and his work on the University of Virginia is beautiful. He was also a micromanaging perfectionist who thought he knew better than everyone else about everything, which made him either a pleasure or a nightmare to work with, depending on whether you enjoyed being told your professional expertise was wrong. He immediately set about modifying Holbein's design with additions that were actually improvements. Jefferson developed the east and west terraces, low wings extending from the main building that provided additional functional space while maintaining the building's visual proportions. These terraces housed offices, storage, and service areas, making the president's house more practical without compromising its appearance. This was good design work. The terraces solved real problems and looked appropriate to the building's style. Jefferson also completed interior spaces that the Adamses had found unfinished. The East Room finally got plastered walls and became usable for its intended purpose, instead of as a laundry facility. Other public rooms received proper finishes, furniture, and decorative elements. Jefferson paid attention to the grounds, directing landscape work that began transforming the muddy construction site into something resembling formal gardens. This was slow progress. Landscaping on this scale takes years, but it started the process of making the president's house grounds look intentional rather than accidental. Inside, Jefferson modified spaces to accommodate his interests. He set up a study and a private suite that reflected his needs as both president and intellectual. He installed bookshelves, scientific instruments, and collections that made the house feel lived in, rather than merely ceremonial. Jefferson's modifications improved the building's functionality significantly. The house became more comfortable, more practical, and more suitable for its dual purpose as residence and workplace. But the improvements Jefferson could make were limited by budget constraints, and the reality that the house was still relatively new and parts were still being finished. The terraces took years to complete. Interior work continued throughout his 2 terms. The grounds remained partly undeveloped. And of course, all this work, modifications, completions, landscaping, was performed by the same mix of free and enslaved workers who'd built the original structure. Jefferson owned enslaved workers himself at Monticello, and he had no moral qualms about continuing to use enslaved labor for federal construction projects. By the time Jefferson left office in 1809, the president's house was finally functioning as intended. It was lived in, worked in, improved from Holbein's original design, and beginning to look like a proper presidential residence. It would last in that form for exactly 5 more years before the British burned it to the ground. But before that fire, the president's house would be transformed by a woman who understood something that the architects and builders had missed. The house wasn't just a residence or an office, it was a stage, and Dolley Madison knew exactly how to use it. When James Madison became president in March 1809, his wife Dolley was 41 years old and already one of the most socially prominent women in Washington. She'd served as hostess for the widowed Thomas Jefferson during his presidency. Jefferson's wife had died years earlier, and his daughters rarely visited Washington, so Dolley had 8 years of experience running White House social events before she officially became First Lady. She understood something fundamental that the men who designed and built the president's house had overlooked. In early Washington, social power was political power. The city had no established society, no old families, no inherited hierarchies. Everything was new. Everything was being negotiated, and whoever controlled the social gatherings controlled access to power. Dolley turned the president's house into the center of Washington's social and political life through a brilliantly simple innovation. She opened it to everyone. Well, not everyone. This was still the early 19th century, and everyone meant everyone who was white and politically connected or socially ambitious. But within those constraints, Dolley's Wednesday evening receptions were radically democratic by the standards of the time. Cabinet members mingled with foreign diplomats. Senators talked to journalists. Federalists and Democratic Republicans who barely spoke to each other in Congress found themselves making small talk over refreshments in the Oval Room. Young people trying to break into Washington society stood next to aging Revolutionary War veterans, telling the same stories they'd told 100 times before. These weren't formal state dinners with rigid protocol and assigned seating. They were open receptions where anyone with appropriate connections could attend, where conversation flowed freely, where political business was conducted informally, while everyone pretended they were just socializing. This was Dolley's genius. She made the president's house feel accessible while still maintaining its prestige. She was warm and welcoming to everyone, genuinely warm, not just performing warmth, while also being strategic about who she spent time with, who she introduced to whom, who got invitations to smaller, more exclusive gatherings. She dressed spectacularly, turbans with feathers, elaborate gowns in bold colors, reds, yellows, vibrant patterns that made her instantly recognizable in any crowded room. She took snuff from a small box, which was unusual for women at the time, and gave her a distinctive quirk that people remembered. She was almost 6 feet tall, striking, and utterly confident in her role. Dolley understood that fashion was power. When she wore something, other women imitated it. When she popularized a color or style, it spread through Washington and beyond. She was a fashion influencer before the term existed, and she used that influence deliberately to maintain her centrality in Washington's society. Her Wednesday receptions became the most important social events in Washington. Missing them meant missing crucial conversations, political gossip, opportunities to make connections. Foreign diplomats attended to gather intelligence about American politics. Ambitious politicians attended to be seen and to network. Everyone attended because everyone else was attending, and being absent suggested you weren't important enough to be there. This wasn't frivolous. This was how politics worked in early Washington, where the federal government was small, the city was undeveloped, and most business was conducted through personal relationships rather than formal bureaucracy. Dolley's social events were where political coalitions formed, where compromises were negotiated informally, where enemies became allies over wine and conversation. She also understood something that many political wives before and since have understood. She could say things and do things that her husband couldn't without political consequences. She could befriend opposition politicians' wives. She could smooth over social conflicts that had political dimensions. She could gather intelligence about what various factions were planning, simply by being friendly and attentive at her own parties. James Madison was brilliant, but socially awkward, small and soft-spoken, not physically imposing or charismatic. Dolley compensated for his weaknesses by being charming, memorable, and socially dominant. Together they were an effective team. He made the political decisions. She made the social connections that enabled those decisions to succeed. But Dolley's position was complicated by the same contradiction that haunted the White House itself. She was creating this democratic social space, this open and accessible president's house, while enslaved workers served the food, maintained the building, and made the whole operation possible. Dolley owned enslaved people. When she married James Madison, she brought enslaved workers with her to the marriage. Throughout their time in the White House, enslaved workers, some owned by the Madisons, some hired from their owners, cooked the elaborate meals for Dolley's receptions, served the guests, cleaned up afterward, and maintained the house. The same Wednesday evening receptions where Dolley welcomed everyone and created this illusion of democratic accessibility were catered and served by people who had no freedom, no rights, no ability to refuse the work. Dolley was kind to the enslaved workers in her household by the standards of the time, which is a very low bar because the standards of the time included owning human beings. She apparently didn't tolerate physical abuse, and she rewarded good service with small gifts and privileges. But she also never freed anyone, never questioned the institution of slavery, and never seemed to see any contradiction between her public role promoting American democracy and her private reliance on enslaved. This moral blind spot was common among wealthy white Americans of her era, which explains it but doesn't excuse it. Dolley was creating an American social culture at the president's house, but that culture was built on the invisible labor of enslaved people whose contributions to her success were never acknowledged. By 1814, Dolley had been First Lady for 5 years and was at the height of her influence. Her Wednesday receptions were legendary. The president's house was established as the center of Washington's social life. Foreign diplomats considered invitations to dinner with the Madisons to be prestigious assignments. And then the British Army marched on Washington, and everything Dolley had built was about to burn. But she would save one piece of it, the most important piece, as it turned out. Not the furniture or the china or the elaborate decorations that had made her receptions so memorable. She would save George Washington's portrait, and in doing so, she would ensure her own place in history as the woman who stood firm when everyone else fled. August 24th, 1814. The War of 1812, which nobody really wanted and which solved exactly nothing, was going badly for America. British forces had landed in Maryland and were marching toward Washington with revenge on their minds. The Americans had burned York, modern-day Toronto, in 1813, destroying government buildings and causing civilian casualties. The British decided turnabout was fair play and planned to burn Washington in retaliation. The Battle of Bladensburg, just outside Washington, was a complete American disaster. Militia forces broke and ran. The road to the capital was wide open. President Madison and his cabinet fled the city, and First Lady Dolley Madison made history by refusing to leave the president's house until she'd supervised the removal of important documents and a famous portrait of George Washington. Dolley Madison's actions that day became legendary. While British forces approached and everyone told her to leave immediately, she directed servants to save papers, documents, and most famously, the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington that still hangs in the White House today. Only after everything salvageable was secured did she finally evacuate, just hours before British troops arrived. The British entered Washington unopposed. They went systematically through government buildings, the Capitol, the Treasury, the President's House, and burned them. At the President's House, British troops piled furniture in the center of rooms and set it ablaze. The wooden interior, framing, floors, paneling, everything combustible, caught fire and burned intensely. Multiple rooms were torched simultaneously to ensure complete destruction, but the British couldn't burn the sandstone walls. Stone doesn't burn, which is why it's excellent construction material if you're worried about fires, invasions, or generally existing in a world where things catch fire regularly. The wooden interior was completely destroyed. The roof burned and collapsed. But the Aquia Creek sandstone walls, blackened and smoke-damaged, but structurally sound, remained standing. A thunderstorm that night helped extinguish the fires before they could completely consume the building. But the damage was catastrophic. The president's house was a burned-out shell, empty and exposed to the elements, its interior completely gone. The British left Washington after their destruction was complete, having made their point about retaliation and consequences. They'd burned the capital of the United States, destroyed the symbols of American government, and sailed away. Washington was left with damaged, smoking ruins where its most important buildings had stood. There was genuine debate about whether to rebuild the Capitol in Washington or abandon it and start over somewhere else. Some argued that rebuilding would be too expensive. Others said the location had always been impractical, and this was a sign to relocate somewhere more defensible and less swampy. But abandoning Washington would look like surrender, like admitting the British had won. So Congress decided to rebuild. James Hoban, who'd designed the President's House 22 years earlier and supervised its original construction, was hired to oversee the reconstruction. He was in his 50s now, experienced, and probably not thrilled about rebuilding something that had taken years to construct the first time. But he accepted the commission, assessed the damage, and planned the reconstruction. The good news: the exterior walls were intact. This meant they could rebuild using the existing structure rather than starting from scratch. The bad news: literally, everything else was destroyed and had to be replaced. Interior framing, floors, plaster, woodwork, stairs, fireplaces, windows, doors, the roof, all of it. Reconstruction began in 1815. Immediately after the war ended, Hoban assembled a workforce similar to the original construction crew: skilled craftsmen, laborers, and enslaved workers hired from their owners. More Aquia Creek sandstone was quarried and transported for repairs to damaged portions of the exterior walls. The fire-blackened walls were covered with a thick layer of white lead-based paint, both to protect the stone and to cover the smoke damage. This is where the White House truly became white. The original building had been whitewashed or painted, but the post-fire coat of paint was thick, uniform, and brilliantly white, transforming the fire-damaged building into something that looked fresh and new. The symbolism was potent, rising from the ashes, renewed and strengthened, literally whitewashing the damage to present an unblemished facade to the world. The interior was completely rebuilt, using the same Georgian design principles as the original: timber framing, plaster walls, decorative elements, fireplaces. Everything was reconstructed to match or improve upon what had been destroyed. Reconstruction was surprisingly fast. By late 1817, less than 3 years after the fire, President James Monroe was able to move into the rebuilt president's house. It wasn't completely finished. Work would continue for months, but it was habitable, functional, and looked magnificent from the outside. The rebuilt White House became a symbol of American resilience. The British had burned it, and Americans had rebuilt it quickly and well. The message was clear: you can damage us, but you can't destroy us. Of course, that message was somewhat complicated by the fact that enslaved workers, people who had no freedom, no rights, no stake in American resilience, had performed much of the reconstruction labor, just as they'd built the original house. But in 1817, that contradiction wasn't something most Americans acknowledged publicly or seemed bothered by privately. The White House stood rebuilt, white, and ready for the next chapter of its history. The 19th century brought continuous changes to the White House. The North Portico was added in 1829, the South Portico in 1824, those iconic columned entrances that appear in every photograph of the building. Interior rooms were redecorated, repurposed, and modified as each new president and first lady put their stamp on the house. Technology advanced. Running water and indoor plumbing were installed in the 1830s. Gas lighting came in the 1840s, replacing candles and oil lamps. Electric lighting was installed in the 1890s, though President Benjamin Harrison was reportedly afraid to touch the switches and made servants turn lights on and off. The White House grounds were developed into the formal gardens and lawns we recognize today. Security measures increased after various assassination attempts and threats. Office space was always inadequate, leading to constant proposals for expansions and renovations. Through all of this, the core structure, Hoban's Georgian design, the sandstone walls, the proportions, remained. The White House evolved, but it remained recognizably the building that had been designed in 1792 and rebuilt after 1814. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt officially adopted the White House as the building's name, replacing Executive Mansion and making official what people had been calling it informally for decades. Roosevelt did more than just rename the building. Within a year of moving in, he discovered that the White House had a serious problem. It was literally falling apart. When Theodore Roosevelt became president in September 1901, following William McKinley's assassination, he moved into the White House with his wife Edith and their 6 children. 6 children, in the White House. This was either going to be delightful or catastrophic, and it turned out to be both. The Roosevelt children, ranging in age from 3 to 17, treated the White House like a very large, very historic playground. They roller skated in the East Room. They slid down the grand staircase on serving trays. They smuggled their pony upstairs in the elevator to cheer up a sick sibling. They played hide and seek in the staterooms and used portraits of former presidents for target practice with spitball. This is exactly the kind of behavior that reveals structural problems with a building, and the White House had many structural problems. The house was over a century old. It had been gutted by fire in 1814 and rebuilt quickly. It had been continuously occupied and modified for 90 years since then, with multiple additions, renovations, and improvements that hadn't always been structurally sound. The building was showing its age in concerning ways. Floors sagged, ceilings creaked ominously. The timber framing from the 1815 reconstruction was rotting in places. The foundations were settling unevenly. Structural engineers brought in to assess the building reported that the state dining room floor was in danger of collapse, held up more by habit than by structural integrity at this point. The East Room floor was so weak that when the Marine Band played for receptions, engineers worried the vibrations might bring the floor down. This is the same room where Abigail Adams had hung laundry a century earlier, which probably would have been safer for the structural integrity of the floor. Beyond the structural problems, the White House was simply inadequate for modern presidential needs. The president's office was on the second floor in the family's residential space, which meant there was no separation between home and work. Staff offices were scattered throughout the building wherever space could be found. Cabinet meetings were held in rooms that were also used for family dining. It was functional but chaotic. Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, decided the solution was a comprehensive renovation that would essentially gut the interior of the White House, rebuild it with modern materials and methods, and add a separate office wing so the president could actually work without having staff meetings in his living room. Congress was not enthusiastic about this plan, primarily because it would be expensive. The estimated cost was $500,000, which in 1902 was a staggering amount of money for a renovation project. There were proposals to simply build a new presidential residence somewhere else and turn the White House into a museum, which would have been cheaper than the proposed renovation. But Roosevelt argued, correctly, that abandoning the White House would be politically and symbolically disastrous. The building was more than just a residence. It was a symbol of American continuity and presidential history. You couldn't just move out because maintenance was expensive. Congress eventually appropriated the money, and in 1902, the most extensive renovation in White House history began. The Roosevelt family moved out temporarily. The interior of the White House was essentially gutted. Floors were torn up. Walls were removed. The rotting timber framing was replaced with steel beams. New foundations were poured where needed. Modern plumbing, heating, and electrical systems were installed throughout. The architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and White oversaw the renovation, with specific instructions to maintain the historical character of the building while modernizing its structure and systems. This is always a difficult balance. How do you rebuild a building from the inside while making it look unchanged from the outside? They managed it reasonably well. The exterior remained unchanged. The major public rooms, East Room, State Dining Room, Blue Room, Red Room, Green Room, were restored to look as they had in the 19th century, but with modern structural support hidden behind the historical finishes. The major innovation was the new West Wing, built separately from the main residence to house the president's office and staff workspace. This solved the space problem and created the functional separation between home and work that modern presidencies required. The West Wing was intentionally modest in scale and appearance, designed not to compete visually with the main White House. It was meant to be practical workspace, not ceremonial space. The Oval Office, now the most famous room in American government, was created in this renovation as the president's private office. The renovation was completed in time for the Roosevelt family to move back in for Christmas 1902, just months after construction had begun. This was remarkably fast work, though it helped that they'd spent an enormous amount of money and hired hundreds of workers to complete the project on an accelerated schedule. The renovated White House that emerged from this project is essentially the White House we know today. The major structural work, done in 1902, stabilized the building for another century. The West Wing concept separated residence from office in a way that all subsequent presidents have maintained. The improvements to mechanical systems brought the building into the 20th century. Edith Roosevelt, who'd managed the logistics of moving her family twice in 1 year and dealt with the chaos of a major renovation, also took the opportunity to make the White House more livable as a family residence. She designated specific private spaces for the family, established protocols for public access versus private areas, and began the tradition of the First Lady having her own staff and social secretary. The Roosevelt renovation established patterns that would define the modern White House: the West Wing as the center of presidential work, the residence as genuinely private family space, and the East Wing, added later, as the First Lady's domain and location for social events. Roosevelt also made the name White House official during his presidency, replacing the formal executive mansion with the popular nickname. He had stationery printed with the White House as the official letterhead, ending decades of confusion about what to call the building officially versus colloquially. The 1902 renovation saved the White House from potential structural collapse and transformed it into a modern presidential residence and office. Without this work, the building might not have survived another decade of continuous use and might have been abandoned as unsafe. But even with all this attention to structure and function, there was still one story that wasn't being told, one history that was being quietly omitted from all the discussions about White House renovation, preservation, and legacy. But for most of its history, the White House's origins, specifically the role of enslaved workers in its construction, were quietly omitted from official histories and public discussions. This wasn't an accident. It was an intentional erasure, a deliberate forgetting, a decision that the story of enslaved workers building the symbol of American democracy was uncomfortable and best left unmentioned. The change began in the late 20th century as historians started doing serious research into the construction records, recovering names where possible, documenting the extent of enslaved labor on the project, and demanding that this history be acknowledged. The White House Historical Association began incorporating this history into educational programs. The National Park Service developed interpretive materials. Physical markers were installed acknowledging the contributions of enslaved workers. It's not comprehensive. Most of the names are still lost, most of the stories untold, but it's no longer erased. The official White House tours now mention that enslaved workers helped build the house. Educational materials acknowledge their contributions. The historical record is being corrected, slowly, decades and centuries later. The White House stands today as a symbol of American democracy, American history, and American contradictions. It was designed by an Irish immigrant, built by free craftsmen and enslaved workers together, burned by the British, rebuilt by the same mix of free and enslaved labor, painted white to cover smoke damage, and continuously modified for over 2 centuries. It's a working office, a private residence, a museum, and a symbol all at once. Presidents have lived there, worked there, made history there for over 220 years. It's witnessed everything from mundane daily routines to decisions that shape the world. And it was built by people whose names we mostly don't know, whose contributions were documented as expenses rather than achievement, who had no freedom but built the house that would become the symbol of freedom. That contradiction is American history in one building: the ideals and the reality, the promises and the compromises, the progress and the costs. The White House is still standing. The work of remembering who built it and acknowledging what that means continues. Good night.